Lenny Summers is one of the most fascinating members of the Linde gang, not just because of how quickly players grow attached to him, but because of what Rockstar quietly sets up in the background. Lenny wasn't just another young outlaw. He was being shaped, intentionally, into a future leader, someone Dutch himself was preparing to become a major figure in the gang long before everything fell apart. And when you look closely at the missions, the dialogue, and the optional interactions, you start to realize that Lenny's death doesn't just mark the end of a good friend, it marks the moment the gang loses the person who could have kept it alive. Lenny enters the game at just 19 years old, one of the youngest members of the gang. Yet, from the very beginning, he stands out. He's educated, one of the few who can read fluently, and he's disciplined, clever, and extremely adaptable. Most gang members have tragic stories, but Lenny's begins more grounded than theatrical. His father was killed by racist killers, and instead of spiraling into chaos, Lenny channeled his anger into determination. He didn't join Dutch because he loved crime. He joined because he believed in something. He believed in justice the way the gang claimed to stand for it. That makes him different. While others like Bill, Javier, or even Arthur fall into outlaw life as an identity, Lenny approaches it with purpose. Dutch sees that. Hosea sees it. Even Arthur remarks on Lenny's potential multiple times. There's a quiet pattern the game builds. Dutch assigns Lenny more serious responsibilities than most members of his age or rank. In Valentine, during the bank robbery setup, Dutch trusts Lenny to scout and support. In St. Denis, Dutch uses him as a key player in the massive bank heist, over more experienced outlaws. And during the trolley station job, Dutch chooses Lenny to run the dynamite charges. That's not random. Dutch almost never takes big risks on young members unless he sees something special in them. Early in the game, Dutch even calls Lenny one of the good ones, a line he rarely uses. Lenny was being molded, intentionally or not, into a figure Dutch could rely on, and maybe, eventually, someone who could replace Arthur as the gang's moral center. Lenny's intelligence is also demonstrated through gameplay. He's one of the only members who constantly thinks ahead and voices doubts. Not out of cowardice, but rationality. When Dutch starts slipping deeper into reckless plans, Lenny questions them quietly. Not confrontational like Arthur, and not panicked like Strauss or Pearson, just thoughtful. He's one of the few who senses the St. Denis heist is doomed before it even starts. When the gang sits around camp planning, Lenny often pitches alternative ideas, ones that are more subtle, less risky. And when Arthur talks to him about the future, Lenny says something incredibly telling. He wants to buy land, settle down, and maybe build a life far away from violence. His dream isn't extravagant like Dutch's or Micah's. It's grounded, realistic. Exactly the kind of dream Hosea always wished the gang would chase. But one of the most surprising details about Lenny is just how much he grows during the story. He begins as a kid running from his father's killers, but he quickly becomes one of the gang's most capable guns during missions. In Rhodes, during the Braithwaite and Gray conflicts, Lenny consistently holds his ground, even saving Arthur more than once. Arthur compliments him often for being reliable, something Arthur rarely says about younger members. And it's not just skill Lenny shows, but resolve. Even when everything becomes chaotic in St. Denis, Lenny never loses his core values. He wants out, but he doesn't want out alone. He wants everyone to make it. That makes him one of the last genuinely selfless members remaining by the midway point of the game. What makes Lenny so tragic is that he symbolizes what the gang could have become if Dutch had stayed who he once was. He represented a next generation of outlaws who were capable, smart, loyal, and humane. Someone who could have guided the gang into a future that wasn't built on Dutch's fantasies or Micah's manipulation. And in a cruel irony, Lenny dies during the exact moment Dutch loses all control. The St. Denis bank heist. Lenny's death isn't accidental thematically. Rockstar placed it at the turning point for a reason. When Lenny falls from that rooftop, Dutch loses the last example of what the gang was supposed to protect. From that moment on, Dutch's descent accelerates. He doesn't just lose a fighter, he loses the gang's brightest future. And Arthur knows it. If you speak to Arthur shortly after Lenny dies, Arthur's tone changes dramatically. He goes from frustrated with Dutch to outright questioning everything. Losing Lenny is one of the first deaths Arthur truly takes personally. Not just because he liked the kid, but because he saw Lenny's potential too. Arthur tells other gang members things like, he was too young, he didn't deserve that, and he had his whole life ahead of him. Arthur rarely talks like that about anyone else. Even Hosea's death hits him differently. Hosea was older, experienced, and expected to go someday. But Lenny was supposed to survive the gang. He was supposed to outgrow it. Lenny's death also shows how little Dutch values his long-term prospects anymore. Dutch barely reacts. He barely acknowledges the loss at all. And that silence is devastating because it proves how far Dutch has drifted from his original principles. In the early years of the gang, Dutch would have mourned Lenny as someone who represented the future. In 1899, he brushes it off. Losing Lenny is the moment the gang stops thinking about tomorrow. They become a group of fugitives running on borrowed time. When you sit with the story long enough, Lenny's arc becomes one of the most important in the entire game. His presence shows what the gang used to stand for, and his death shows what it can never be again. Rockstar didn't just kill a character, they removed the person who could have rebuilt everything after Arthur's illness and Dutch's downfall. Lenny was smart enough, charismatic enough, and morally strong enough to eventually lead. But the chaos of St. Denis never gave him the chance. In the end, Lenny Summers becomes the embodiment of lost potential in Red Dead Redemption 2. Not just for himself, but for the entire van der Linde gang. His story isn't just tragic, it's symbolic. When Lenny dies, the gang's future dies with him. And that's why, long after the credits roll, players still think about him. Because deep down, we all recognize what Arthur recognized. Lenny wasn't just a good kid. He was the one who could have made things right. What makes Lenny's story even more compelling is how Rockstar hints that he was beginning to see through Dutch much earlier than most of the gang. While Arthur slowly realizes Dutch is losing it, Lenny picks up on this shift far sooner, through small moments a lot of players miss. When Dutch starts making reckless decisions in roads, you can hear Lenny mutter doubts under his breath during camp conversations, questioning the logic behind the moves Dutch claims are for the greater good. But he does it quietly, respectfully, because Lenny isn't confrontational by nature. He still believes in the ideals Dutch sold him, even if he's beginning to see the cracks in the man selling them. This subtle shift shows a maturity beyond his years and a growing awareness that the gang's future may not be as golden as Dutch pretends. One of the strongest examples of Lenny's emerging independence comes from the optional camp interactions. If you talk to him around the fire, Lenny discusses the world beyond outlaw life, and it's clear he's already imagining life after the gang. He talks about studying, earning honest money, building a respectable future. These aren't the dreams of someone who's disconnected from reality. These are the dreams of someone who sees the limits of the gang's lifestyle. Even Arthur, who's far older and far more world-weary, often seems surprised by Lenny's maturity. Arthur's journal entries imply a deep respect for Lenny, noting the young man's intelligence and drive. This dynamic, Arthur grounded in experience and Lenny grounded in ambition, shows how unique Lenny was in a world full of people running from their past instead of building futures. It also becomes clear that Lenny was forming a bond with Arthur that could have evolved into one of the gang's strongest partnerships if they had survived longer. During missions where the two are paired, they show an impressive synergy. Arthur's grit and intuition balanced by Lenny's quick thinking and calm adaptability. Rockstar even uses humor, like the legendary Valentine drunken night, to deepen the relationship. That mission, while comedic, symbolically shows Lenny letting go of his pain long enough to enjoy being young. It also cements the two as a duo whose personalities complement each other perfectly. In a different timeline, one where St. Denis doesn't collapse, they might have become the heart and backbone of a reformed version of the gang.